Good evening. Welcome to the third installment of our Black History classes here in the month of February, Black History Month. This is a work that is being sponsored by Prophetic Voices, which is a confederation of African American churches in this community. These classes are ongoing not just here at Shiloh, but also at the New Sunlight Baptist Church, the Elm Grove Baptist Church, the Donaldson Chapel Baptist Church, and the Redwood Baptist Church. And we're happy to be a part of this experience. We're grateful to you for coming tonight. We're grateful for our instructor, Dr. Albert Samuels, who's going to come in just a moment. Let's bow our heads, please, in a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to assemble ourselves together here. Thank you for this learning experience. Thank you for what we have already learned, what we have already gleaned, and we look forward, dear God, with great anticipation to what information will be shared with us this evening. We ask your blessings upon our instructor, that you might use him in a mighty way, and that you would make our minds open and receptive, that we would leave here with a better understanding of who we are, where we came from, and what our potential is going forward. Give relevance, meaning, and purpose to this experience. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Again, let us welcome Dr. Albert Samuels.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing this week? Oh, that's good. First of all, welcome to everybody. It's good to see a lot of you back. I think I've seen one or two people here that I hadn't seen before. So it's good to welcome everyone back. Thank once again Pastor Smith for asking me to do this and the opportunity to participate in this. Also for anyone who's joining us virtually, we welcome you as well to what we're going to be doing. Our first 2 weeks, first week we talked about slavery and the centrality of slavery, and the idea that slavery is not an off-ramp on the highway of American history, but rather it's really central to the narrative about how we came to be the nation that we are. And so that was part of our point in our first session. Last week, we talked about some of the various ways in which Black people have resisted, have dealt with the fact that we are the only people who didn't ask to come here. And so we talked through some of those points, and we've done all of this in the context of Christian principles. Because physical training is of some value, but training in godliness has value for all things, both in this life and in the life to come. And so that has been what we've done in the first 2 weeks. Tonight, our focus is going to be on Reconstruction, episode 1, and the sequel, deliberately playing off of some of this movie metaphor. On our last session together next week, to kind of give you some foreshadowing, we will be talking about the rise of Obama and the aftermath. I think y'all know what we'll be talking about. So let's begin tonight talking about Reconstruction and episode 1 and the sequel. And so in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, General Lee surrenders at Appomattox on April 9th. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln, who has really gone through a transformation, This is the guy who in 1858 was talking about black people as being inferior to whites. The war begins, and he says that if I could save the Union and keep everybody enslaved, I would do that. If I could save the Union and free all the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union and some people would be slaves and some people would be free, I would do that. He's thinking about colonization as late as 1862, but then he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And then at some point he invites black people to join the Union Army, and 200,000 black people joined the Union Army, a critical manpower advantage that the Union had. That was, in many ways, was decisive in that war. And so on April 11th, you know, there was a crowd gathered around the White House, and he's speaking to people on the balcony. And Lincoln is kind of thinking out loud. He's thinking about the idea that maybe some of the blacks who fought in the war as soldiers, maybe they have earned the right to vote. He's thinking out loud. And in the crowd is a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, who says that's the last speech he will ever give. Okay. That Friday night, which, by the way, was Good Friday, that Sunday was Easter, he goes into the president's box, fires a gun, shoots the president, kills him. And so in the space of an assassin's bullet, we go from the greatest president in American history to Andrew Johnson, who was probably, other than perhaps Donald Trump, probably the most ill-suited person to ever occupy the White House. Now, Andrew Johnson actually was a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. And keep in mind, there were some Southerners who did not support the war. Andrew Johnson was one of those people. He basically was what you would call poor white trash. He was not well-born, and so many people like him actually resented the slave-holding aristocracy because they looked down upon them, and they felt like this war was being fought to protect them. So they resented them, did not support secession, but make no mistake about it, he's still a racist. And so he sympathized with Southern whites and poor whites. And so he believes that now it's time for the government to support poor white people. And so this is the guy who's now the president of the United States. And he, as president, he's liberally giving pardons to a lot of ex-Confederates, a lot of these same people who had looked down upon him. Now they have to come to him to get a pardon. And he kind of likes that. Congress, by the way, is not in session. Congress will not be in session until about December. In those days, the country was primarily agricultural. And so oftentimes, Congress would not go into session until late fall, November, December, after the harvest. By the way, one of the reasons that the tradition developed for having elections in November was because it was after the harvest. And so he's giving all these pardons to people, and he's giving so many pardons that, quite frankly, many of the same people who started the war have now gotten a full pardon. And so they are reorganizing Southern state governments, and they're passing a series of laws to deal with black people. And see, this is where the rub is. You see, simply abolishing slavery, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. It's enacted in 1865. It's going to be ratified later in that year. And so the abolition of slavery by itself doesn't answer the question, the legal question of actually what is now the legal status of the slave. Of the now the newly freed people. You know, because just because they are no longer slaves doesn't necessarily mean they have the same rights as white men. In fact, in many of the northern states, in fact, free black people actually had been losing rights over this time period. So it wasn't necessarily obvious what the situation was. And so in the interim, many southern states replaced the slave codes with the black codes, which were designed to circumscribe the rights of African Americans. Not going into a whole lot of detail. Basically, the idea was, though you are not slaves, you are not the equals of white men. You may no longer be slaves, but you are still niggas. And that's what the point was designed to bring across. And of course, this also happened in an environment of racial violence and terrorism going on a long time. So it's not. So this is sort of the context. This is what Congress is going to find when they come into session. When they come into session, there are southern states. There are Tennessee being one of them that are asking to be readmitted into the Union. And so if you let Tennessee in, then what about Louisiana? What about Alabama? What about Mississippi? All these other states are going to be one to be let in. Not only are they trying to get in, but see, now that the 13th Amendment is in the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise has gone away. And so that means that now southern states, instead of being able to count 3/5 of blacks toward representation, they'll be able to count all 5/5. So you would have a situation where they actually would have even more power than they had before they seceded. That's what they're asking for. They had the audacity to ask for in late 1865, early 1866. So Congress responds, and Congress responds by saying, first of all, we're not doing that. We're not going to allow the southern states in just yet, number one. Number two, they're going to pass a series of, they're going to pass what's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's designed to outlaw the black codes. They're going to pass it over Andrew Johnson's veto. And Andrew Johnson, by being intransigent, he actually unites people who were kind of not sure if we want to do this or not. But because Andrew Johnson was so intransigent, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 passes over his veto, and it establishes a whole bunch of new rights, economic, civil, rights for African Americans. However, it wasn't clear, there were concerns about whether or not this new law was constitutional or not. One, Congress had never done this before. But secondly, they weren't sure if the courts would strike it down. And this was not an abstract concern, because the Supreme Court had only a few years ago, before that, in the Dred Scott case in 1857, they had said, black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. So it was more than just an abstract fear that a Congress may strike this down. I'm sorry, Supreme Court might make it down, or it could be a future Congress could come along and say, and just repeal it. Mm-hmm. And so those concerns ultimately led to the enactment of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Excuse me. And so Section 1 of the 14th Amendment reads, it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state may make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive to any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny any person within their jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws. That's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It has, as a citizenship clause. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States or citizens of the United States. Again, it's written in general language, but the context is about black people. It's just the United States. Now, having said that, it says no state can abridge the privileges and immunities, which is a clause that meant simply this idea that people's rights shouldn't change if they go from one state to another. That was kind of the general idea. Nor may anyone deprive anyone of their life, liberty, or property, which are the three worst things the government can do to you in order. Is to either take away your life, your liberty, or your property. You can't do that without due process of law. Nor deprive anyone the equal protection of laws, equality for the law. That's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, before we go further in discussing the 14th Amendment, one thing I want to emphasize about it is that oftentimes the story of emancipation and things like this are told as if black people were sort of passive bystanders. And in fact, it's what other people gave us these rights. Right. But in fact, many of the ideas that ultimately were incorporated in the 14th Amendment were black ideas. These were black ideas. Often, a lot of this was the result of agitation by free black people in many of these northern states. Keep in mind that after the American Revolution, the period between 1775 and 1812 was actually the most rapid growth of the free Negro class in American history. Prior to that, very few black people were free, but partly because of the American Revolution and the rhetoric of freedom, that actually did have an effect, at least in some places, and it would start a process in which northern states would gradually begin to abolish slavery. It kind of phased it out. It varied depending on what state it was, but what that did was it actually created an actual class of free black people. And so now, what do we do about this? This is a new problem we have in some of these places. What do we do about this? Well, what happened in some places is that, we don't really like this idea of this group of black people, and so we're going to make distinctions in the law based upon that, and we're going to do things to try to discourage them from even moving here in the first place, i.e. Ohio, for example. Which had a series of black laws. Look where Ohio is located. Ohio literally is on the border between slavery and freedom. On the other side of the river is Kentucky, which is a slave state. To its south and east is Virginia. Keep in mind, there was no West Virginia at that time. It was just Virginia. And so as some of these people who are becoming free, they're coming across into Ohio in places like that, because they're not really exactly welcome in Virginia, so they come across Ohio. And so, what does Ohio do? Ohio creates a series of black laws to make a legal distinction. In some ways, it's kind of reminiscent of what we're seeing right now with people at the southern border. Who are saying, we don't want these people coming here, and so we're going to try to do things to discourage them from coming here. However, in response to that, a lot of black people began to agitate about about their rights. What do our rights mean? What happens when we travel from one state to the other? For example, black seamen. Blacks oftentimes were disproportionately present in ships and merchant marines, what have you, because we were doing work that most white folks didn't want to do. So if I am recognized as a citizen in New York, what happens when my ship docks in Charleston or in New Orleans? And there were cases about this, about these things, about what do rights mean when you move from one place to the other? And so black people are agitating about this. They're fighting laws in their states, and it's not clear if the federal government has any power to do anything about it. And so it's black people who come up with ideas like birthright citizenship. That idea came from black folks. And so to some degree, some of the ideas that come out in the 14th Amendment, and eventually, some whites get involved, and they're influenced by that, but it's actually black people who come up with a lot of these ideas, and they're agitating for this. And so with this, like slavery itself and the end of slavery itself, black people are not just hanging around waiting for somebody to save them. Black people took their future in their own hands, and so I think we want to make sure that as we talk about this, that we realize that that black people are active participants in this. We're not just standing around, and so I just want to summarize real quickly some of the legal and constitutional triumphs of this period. This is the period we're referring to as kind of Reconstruction. It's like, what do we do now after the end of slavery? And how do we rebuild the country after 4 years of this is the most destructive war in American history? And so there is the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude. Except as a punishment for crime. We'll come back to that later. There's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That's it. I think that's another slide. You're kind of behind there. There's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That gives that strikes down the black codes and gives black people a whole new series of civil rights and political rights, and economic rights. It stops short of voting, of course. Then there's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which grants some citizenship rights, rights to the ex-slaves, and the notion of the equal protection of the law. Then the 15th Amendment, prohibits states from using race to deny the right to vote. Now, this, of course, this right to vote at the time is still only to men. Actually, this is the first time the word male actually gets in the Constitution. And then finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is like the last hurrah, will outlaw racial discrimination in public accommodations. So when you put all those together, this looks pretty good. This is off to a pretty good start. And in the context of a lot of this, it's, things are uneven. In some ways, black people are making real progress. Black people are voting. Voting in large, the first, voting in large numbers. Black people will have worked 6 days of the week, and maybe on a Saturday, they would walk 25 miles in some cases to a political meeting. And they're learning about ideas of democracy and trying to figure these things out. These are people just coming out of slavery. And some of them, and black people are getting elected, and they're serving in the legislature. And there's black people who come up with ideas like public education in the South. W.B. Du Bois says that the idea of public education in the South was a Negro idea. Tax-supported public education did not exist in the South prior to the Civil War. It just didn't exist. So a lot of these Reconstruction legislatures bring these things about. Black people are starting businesses. Black people are attaining property. And certainly there are other things that are happening that are not even, but black people are starting to make progress during this time period, which white folks don't like. Which white folks don't like. And so there's a backlash, obviously, then to Reconstruction. You know, as you know, when white Southerners contemplated what might happen to them if they lost the war, and what that might mean if they lost the war, there were a lot of things they imagined, but never did it occur to them that the same people whom we have for centuries said are inferior to us would have the right to vote and to hold office. And the idea of equality, legal equality to them, it didn't occur to them that could be one of the possible outcomes, you know, to them. And so for many whites, black equality means Negro domination. For them, equality means domination. In other words, equality with black people is impossible. So the idea of equality means and of course we can't have that. It can't happen. It can't happen. You know what? And so, you know, so though the Confederate Army has been defeated in the field, then it's replaced by a whole lot of vigilante groups. You know, it's Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Ku Klux Klan and groups like this. It's within Louisiana. It's the Knights of the White Camellia. It's the White League. It's a variety of vigilante groups began to rise up. And during this period, you know, to try, they respond with rage. They attack. They burn down schools. They try and intimidate people from voting. They all kinds of things they're engaged in to try to put black people back in their place. Who do you think you are? And so one way of thinking of this is it's sort of like an insurgency. A guerrilla war. And in part because Americans haven't told the truth about our history. You know, I say, you know, a lot of times we say, well, black people don't know their history. White people don't either. You know, Americans not only don't know their history, they don't know anybody else's. And it's because America has lied, and they have lied about this period. Not only do we not understand this history, but we also make other mistakes in the world. Like, for example, when we sent an army into Iraq, and within a short amount of time, oh yeah, we whipped Saddam Hussein's army. I mean, quickly, bam, 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 it was over. It was over. You know, but of course, only white people could think that we can go into somebody else's country, blow everything up, and they're just supposed to be happy about that. They're just going to accept us as liberators, right? You know, and but they ended up with an insurgency. You know, because you won the conventional phase of the war, But there's an insurgency now in this country, a guerrilla warfare. Thing that happened in Afghanistan. Yeah, you won real easily, but that's an insurgency. And eventually, what we end up doing, we had to withdraw. And don't understand that. Well, that happened here. That happened here. These groups, it was an insurgency. Yeah, you defeated Lee's army, but you didn't kill the idea of white supremacy. So you had this violent backlash against Reconstruction. But in addition to the violent backlash, you had backlashes in the legal institutions as well. The Supreme Court of the United States plays a role in actually nullifying some of these things we just talked about. Some of these people thought these legislative achievements had settled the question, and within a short amount of time, black people have gotten most of the rights that people have been fighting for generations. And the Supreme Court is going to actually nullify a lot of those victories. In a series of decisions. The Supreme Court in 1873 says that in a case called the Slaughterhouse Cases, the Supreme Court basically says that the 14th Amendment, the rights of Americans the Americans' basic rights are under the protections of states' governments. That the 14th Amendment only really deals with a really narrow set of rights. Most of your rights are under the protections of state governments. Now, wait a minute, aren't those the same governments that allow slavery in the first place? The Supreme Court is going to say a few years later in United States versus Cruikshank that the 15th Amendment did not confer upon anyone the right to vote. Rather, the right to vote comes from state citizenship. It's not based on the federal, it's based on the states. In 1883, the court is going to hold that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlaws discrimination and public accommodation, that's unconstitutional. Because the 14th Amendment, they argue, was meant to apply to the actions of states, state governments. It doesn't apply to private businesses or private individuals. They're not state actors. Individuals have the right, organization have the right to discriminate, to decide who their members are. The 14th Amendment only applies to the actions of states. And then, of course, there is Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that separate facilities for the races don't violate the 14th Amendment as long as they're equal. And of course, the court ain't gonna be too concerned about what equal actually means. So it's not just the Klan, it's not just the White League, it's not just these other folks, but it's also the people in ties and robes, who are also undermining what people thought the war was about, the settlement of the war. And so Reconstruction is going to come to an end. Reconstruction comes to an end. The Northern public eventually loses patience for what's required. There's these constant military interventions, and eventually folks are like, why are we still sending troops down there? You know, and so that's the public, so that's the public in the North starts to kind of lose patience. Then there's the 1876 presidential election that is disputed. And if you thought the 2000 election or the 2020 election was drama, the 1876 election was the most controversial election in American history. In fact, some people thought that it might lead to another civil war. There were 4 states where the electoral votes were disputed, and the dispute lasted for months. Eventually, a deal was struck where the Southern Democrats said, you know, we'll allow Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, to be president if you will remove the remaining federal troops from the South. And so on the basis of that compromise, the electoral votes were awarded to the Republican. And we typically say that's the end of Reconstruction as the federal troops leave the South, and Southern Democrats regain control of Southern politics. The so-called Redeemers regain control of Southern politics. You know, so we're going to come to an end. Now, before we leave the subject of the first episode of Reconstruction, we also need to deal with the fact that Louisiana, state of Louisiana, plays a starring role in the destruction of Reconstruction. Louisiana plays a starring role in the destruction of Reconstruction. Actually, a couple things we need to know about Louisiana at the time. Louisiana was actually one of the first places that the Union Army occupied. You know, when they came in, actually they took New Orleans basically without firing a shot. You know, now the shooting started later. So you know, so actually, you know, kind of in a way, Reconstruction kind of started in Louisiana even before the war started, as the Union Army began to move further north, and Confederates kept retreating. They kept retreating. You know, as they kind of move forward. Louisiana was also one of 3 states where blacks were the majority. South Carolina was the other. Mississippi was the third, and there were also other states where blacks were over at least 40% of the population. So that means that democracy. So democracy might mean black people rule. If we actually have real democracy in Louisiana, this is something that white people cannot tolerate. The idea, see, democracy is okay as long as white rule is assured. When democracy means that we may actually share power with black people, we'll burn it down. White folks, they'll burn it down. No, rather than share power, and so Louisiana is really at the tip of the spear of this fight to destroy, dismantle Reconstruction. So, for example, some of the cases I just mentioned, the Slaughterhouse case came out of Louisiana. United States versus Cruikshank, that came out of Louisiana. That was a result of that was in reaction to the Colfax massacre in 1873. Some of you familiar with Colfax? You know, some of you may have gone to the Pecan Festival. You know, they usually have in the fall. In Colfax, in Grant Parish, you know, they specifically named that parish Grant Parish because they named it after Ulysses S. Grant. Just to make them mad. Okay, they call it in Grand Parish. A group of black folks, a little militia, they had were trying to defend the Republican sheriff, who they believe legitimately won the election. You know, the white Democrats were refusing to acknowledge him as the legitimate winner. So they occupied the courthouse because the white folks wouldn't leave. So the white folks got together a posse of folks that surrounded them. They besieged him. After it's been looking pretty hopeless. They promised them, we'll give you safe passage if you surrender. Which was a lie, because when people did try to surrender, they shot them instead, and they actually set the courthouse on fire and were shooting people as they were trying to flee. And the Supreme Court basically said, because these were private individuals, they overturned the convictions of some of the people who had been prosecuted. Now, now, mind you, that a lot of people who were involved in this still escaped. So they still escaped prosecutions. But even the few people who were tried, the court reversed their convictions. And so it communicated the idea that you can kill black people with impunity and get away with it. This is the that's the Cruikshank case. Louisiana. By the way, we had an insurrection in Louisiana in 1873. The White League literally tried to overthrow the government. At the time in New Orleans was at that time was state capital. We had an insurrection. They had to call in federal troops. Louisiana, and of course, Louisiana is the place where the Plessy versus Ferguson case originated. The law, the Separate Car Act, was written by Murphy Foster, who later became governor of the state. And that case came out of New Orleans. Louisiana is also the state that also came up with the grandfather clause that other states emulated. And actually the grandfather clause was in some ways it was designed to designed to make sure that whites who were able to vote prior to 1867 but may not have met some of the new requirements, that they could still vote. So the idea of something being grandfathered in, meaning that you're changing the law, but allowing those who were in the certain status prior to that then to be grandfathered in. That's where that phrase comes from. And so basically, in the 1890s, a whole variety of tactics were used to deny the right to vote. The grandfather clause I just mentioned, the poll tax. The poll tax, had to be paid. Had to be paid periodically. If you didn't pay the poll tax in this election, in the next election you owe for that year, and the year after that, and it will accumulate. The literacy test. Some states had constitutional tests. You must answer some question about the state constitution or the U.S. Constitution, and you must answer it to the satisfaction of the person administering the exam. They have exclusive right to decide whether or not you passed. And then there's the white primary. You see, even if you could survive these other methods, the white primary eliminated most black people. Because see, in those days, the Democratic Party at the time was the only game in town. Because no self-respecting white person in the South was going to vote Republican. So the Democrats were the only people who had a legitimate chance to win. And so with the Democratic primaries were really the election that really mattered. Because Democrats could afford to have really knockdown, drag-out fights among themselves because they knew that ultimately no Republican could win. So we're going to say that the Democratic Party is a private association that has the right to decide who its members are. So we say that you must be white to participate in the primary. So that even if you could survive these other methods, we're going to eliminate you from the only election that actually matters. The primary. And of course, when all this fails, violence. Violence and intimidation. When all this fails. And this is So to give an example here, Louisiana is a case study in how effective these methods of disenfranchisement were. In 1890, for example, in Louisiana, even despite some of the things that had been happening since 1877, black people didn't lose all their rights at one time. And so over 130,000 black Louisianians were registered to vote in 1890. Okay. However, after 1897, keep in mind, after they stole the election in 1896, in 1897, after they passed their new registration law, and then they had a constitutional convention in 1898, and the cumulative effect of all of these changes meant that by 1900, the black electorate had shrank to just slightly over 5,000. So if you go from over 130,000 to about 5,000 within a space of over 10 years. But it gets worse. By 1904, that number had become less than 2,000. Because by that time, the poll tax was fully implemented. Now, and the number of blacks registered to vote in Louisiana would not rise above 2,000 until the 1940s. Until after the white primary, for example, was finally declared unconstitutional in Smith versus Allwright in 1944. In fact, in 1940, the exact number of blacks who were registered to vote in the state of Louisiana was 886. So let that number sink in. In 1940, the total size of the black electorate was 886 voters. Okay, there are towns in Louisiana that are smaller than that. That's the total number of blacks. So these methods were very effective, and of course, it's always backed up by violence. And keep in mind, the violence is not just to keep black people in line. The violence also keeps white people in line. You see, there's a reason why oftentimes so frustratingly few white folk sometimes join our causes. It's not because everybody agrees, with the prevailing status quo, but you have to be willing to impose a cost on the white person who knows this is wrong. So the people are too scared to do the right thing, or are concerned about what they will lose. And you have to be willing to make an example of the white person this is what's going to happen to you if you side with black folk. So there's a reason. There's a reason. Everybody, you don't need everybody. You don't necessarily need the majority in order for a system of oppression to exist. You simply need enough people who are afraid to do anything. Enough people who will do nothing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. That's all it requires. So in summary, I'm just going to suggest, so when we think about why Reconstruction unraveled, I just want to submit 4 quick ideas as to why Reconstruction unraveled. The first of these, number one, racism was never simply a Southern problem. And racism is an American problem. Uh, as black people who left the South and go to the North quickly found out. Slavery was never merely a Southern problem. We already talked extensively on how to go into detail about how northern colonies, northern states benefited from slavery. So slavery was never just simply a Southern problem. It was a national problem. Secondly, few northern whites appreciated the scale of the problem of remedying the consequences of slavery. It defied their imagination to imagine all that what we required. It was more than just simply putting some legal rights in place and hoping black people and giving people the right to have their own farms and they'll take care of themselves. They just lacked the imagination of what it would take, and how much opposition there would be, to that. And this today is still a problem. There are many, sometimes well-meaning liberal whites who just don't get it, and they regularly underestimate how much other white people will resist. Oftentimes they're too willing to give their other white colleagues the benefit of the doubt. And so few northern whites appreciated the scale of what will be required, that this is a system that had been in place for hundreds of years, and it was going to take more than a couple of years to deal with that. America wasn't prepared for that. So that's thirdly, by the 1890s, you have a new generation of Republicans who are emerging, who are now the leaders who are coming into fore. And this is the first generation of Americans who were not born, whose formative experiences are not during the period when slavery was legal. They are not informed by the debates of the 1850s. They were not, or the actual conflict of the 1860s. You have a whole new generation. They have a different perspective. And the same way we're dealing with them. Actually, as we move further and further away from some of the events of the civil rights movement and the period right after that, what it is, then you're dealing with a whole new generation that just doesn't have that perspective. They just see the world differently. And then finally, after about 1896, the Republican Party, at the time the Republican Party was really the party of Lincoln. It was the party where black people supported Republicans the way they support Democrats now. But from 1876 to about 1892, national elections were very close and very contested in many ways. So the Republicans had to at least, even if they didn't mean it, they had to at least pretend they were still concerned about civil rights, even though, a lot of times, even when they had the power, they didn't do anything about it. They still had to at least pretend they were concerned about it. But what happens after 1896, after a depression, Republicans win a huge landslide election. They controlled the Congress, they controlled the presidency, and they are the majority party from this point on until 1932. In other words, they can win national elections without black vote. And so now that they feel a lot more secure, they're willing to let the South do its thing. And so because of this, that means we need to have a new Reconstruction. Because and of course things, and so we're going to just kind of fast forward. Obviously, there's a whole lot of things that happen in this time period. We don't have time to cover all that, but certainly a lot of people view that the modern, what we call the modern civil rights movement, is like a second Reconstruction. construction, and there are a lot of landmarks. You guys are familiar with this. Brown versus Board of Education, for example. Which, separate, separate but equal has no place. In education, it strikes down Plessy, versus Ferguson. The Montgomery bus boycott, and which tips off a mass movement, and the country is introduced to a young Baptist preacher who just moved to town, named Martin Luther King. And that's, and then there of course there are the sit-ins and the Freedom Rise and Freedom Summer, and which things that highlight the role of young people and young activists and the energy they brought to the movement. There were a lot of students from Southern University, who were part of the sit-ins, downtown. And in fact, because of those students, their case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. That vindicated people's rights to protest. It came out of this city. This city. And of course, there's the landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is really the most comprehensive civil rights bill ever enacted by the Congress of the United States, and it's followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is historically has been the most important and most effective voting rights legislation that Congress has ever enacted. And finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It's not referred to the Fair Housing Act. So many of us are familiar with a lot of these, landmark events. Of course, none of this happened without a lot of resistance. Not just resistance, massive resistance. Massive resistance. For just the Brown decision. Many Southerners, white Southerners, viewed the Brown decision as if their entire way of life was being assaulted. Members of Southern members of Congress had a Southern manifesto that we're going to oppose. We're going to oppose desegregation. We're going to oppose integration. States like Louisiana came up with all kinds of new ways to try to enforce segregation, despite what the Supreme Court has said. We don't care what the Supreme Court says. We're going to maintain segregation. We're going to defy federal authority. When Ruby Bridges attempted to attend elementary school, you had folks standing outside, not just the folks who were screaming, and by the way, the children and the grandchildren of them are trying to prevent their children from learning about that. And so, it wasn't just that, but they tried to literally bankrupt the school system in New Orleans. They mounted a boycott. They tried to destroy the public school system in New Orleans rather than integrate. The state of Virginia closed their public schools for 5 years rather than integrate. And actually, it's because of the system of private subsidies that they came up with that people like Milton Friedman came up with the idea of vouchers. South Carolina put the Confederate flag on its Capitol dome as a way of showing we're not going to integrate. So they used all the levers of power they had to try to prevent racial desegregation, integration from happening. And of course, in addition to what they did, what they did, and of course they responded with violence. With all kinds of violence, what they did to Emmett Till, the civil rights workers in 1964, the murders of Medgar Evers, they bombed churches, they killed the four girls in Birmingham, So as black people are using nonviolent tactics over and over again, white people continually respond over and over again with violence. The kids are on the Freedom Rides, riding the buses, and they firebombed some of the buses. They threw people in jail, in some of the worst prisons in Mississippi, for daring to stand up, So as black people continue to respond with nonviolence, white people respond constantly with violence. So this massive, resistance. Now, of course, after the civil, however, black people are still able to eventually accomplish some of these legislative goals, and so then there's a shift begins to happen, as some political leaders. Actually, George Wallace is one of the first of those to do this, and then later the Republican Party picks up on this, and that's the idea that it's no longer at some point becomes no longer socially acceptable to be overtly racist. Whereas in the 1950s, the 1950s in the immediate aftermath of Brown, a lot of Southern politicians were in this competition to see who could say nigger first. In fact, George Wallace actually lost an election in 1958 because he wasn't racist enough. And after losing the election, George Wallace says, "No one is ever going to out-nigger me again." But in the context of his battles with the federal government over integrating the University of Alabama, he was getting letters from all over the country, from white folks in other parts of the country who were supporting him. And he started saying, there's a national reach for this message. So he's going to run for president. And he started changing the message. He started saying, look, it's not, it's no longer as socially acceptable to be overtly racist. So if we couch that in code language, if we use what we call dog whistles to so when we talk about, we're not against integration, we're against busing. We're against forced busing. You know what? We oppose courts, imposing their views over democratic majorities. Taking power away from the elected representatives. And so when they talk about crime, they're talking about race. When they talk about quotas, they're talking about race. When they're talking about welfare, they're talking about race, right? And so the Republican Party and Richard Nixon, Southern Strategy, sort of picks this idea up. And we can use these kinds of appeals to peel off Southern Democrats who used to vote, and get them to vote Republican. And this strategy works. It begins, and Richard Nixon, not only does he win the election, but this type of politics then becomes the staple of the Republican Party. This is how they run. This is how they win elections, And so Ronald Reagan, and he begins his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, talking about states' rights, which happens to be the same place where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered. There was no reason strategically and electorally for him to begin his campaign there. Mississippi was not a battleground state. It was going to vote Republican. But he was trying to show white folk in the South, see, I'm with you. That was his, that was his approach. That was his approach. He sides with, for example, Bob Jones University, a university that pretends to be a Christian institution, that is going before the Supreme Court for the right to remain all white and still get federal funds in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says you can't take federal money as an institution and discriminate on the basis of race, creed, color, national origin. Supreme Court ruled against them 9-0. However, the Reagan Justice Department weighed in on Bob Jones University's side. It's George H.W. Bush, who in his campaign, and the Willie Horton ad, this becomes the way Republicans win. Jesse Helms was about to lose his Senate race in North Carolina to Harvey Gantt, the guy who was the mayor of Charlotte. And then he starts making affirmative action to set up his campaign. You wanted that job. You were qualified for that job. But they had to give that job to a minority. And all of a sudden, Jesse Helms came from behind and won the election. Same thing happened this becomes the staple. This is how Republicans win. Harold Ford loses the Senate race in Tennessee in 2006. Young, attractive black man, like guy, fairly conservative, trying to appeal middle of the road. I'm a Democrat, but I'm kind of middle of the road, trying to appeal to white folks. But they had this picture of him. He supposedly was on this, he was on this cruise, this Playboy cruise, and there's this little white girl, this whole got the whole Mandingo thing going. And Bob Corker ends up winning that race, coming from somehow he miraculously comes from behind. This becomes how they win. But Republicans will deny that this is about race, because we're not conservatives because we're racist. We're conservatives because we're strong on national defense. We're strong on national, defense. We're anti-Vietnam War, blaming the liberals. The liberals are the ones who weaken the country. They appease our enemies. We're strong on national defense. That's the reason why we're Republicans. We're Republicans because we are economic conservatives. We believe that that in a laissez-faire economy, and so that's why we are Republicans. We're not Republicans because we're racist. We're Republicans because we're economic conservatives. Oh, no. We're Republicans because we're social conservatives. Okay? We're Republicans because we don't like what the Supreme Court did in Roe versus Wade. We're Republicans because we believe that there should be prayer in public school. We're Republicans because we're against homosexuality. We're against pornography. We're Republicans because of our social values. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because, see, some people might be national security conservatives. Some people actually might be economic conservatives, and some people actually might have some socially conservative views. They may actually be sincere in the things that they say. That's true. But it is also true that there are also people who have strategically manipulated these issues. Okay, and this is why we call it dog whistling, because there are people who may generally be motivated by those issues, who may not hear the racial message that's the racial message. Like a dog, hears at a higher frequency that the human ear can't pick up. So maybe they may not pick that message up. But the racists hear it, and they know exactly what you're talking about. And see, keep in mind, and even some of those issues we talked about, national security, this ain't about race. Well, maybe it isn't, but guess what? The United States hasn't fought a war against a white nation since World War II. Every war we fought since then has been against people who are brown, black, yellow. So maybe I don't think that's an accident. Okay, when people talk about it's about economic conservatism. It's about the role of government. It's about welfare dependency and economic. And it's economic. Keep in mind, but there's a racial element to that too. You see, a lot of white folks didn't have a problem with big government as long as big government was only helping white folks. They didn't have a problem with big government when the FHA program was discriminating against black folks. They didn't have a problem with it when black folks were getting cut out of the farm subsidy, when black people were getting cut out of GI Bill. All of that stuff, all of these things, these big government things that people, these are things that help, are the foundation for what we now call the American middle class. And so as long as it only helped white folks, they were okay with it. The problem they had with the Great Society is the notion that black people might be able to benefit from some of this. Now it's a problem. Now it's affirmative action. Now it's wrong. If black people started to benefit from it, that's when it, and so that's, and that became the deal breaker. And so, so conservatives began to paint government as big government as unfairly transferring hardworking taxpayer dollars from hardworking white folks to undeserving black folk. And so they have been able to reshape the way people view government and liberalism in general. And a lot of it had to do with race. See, it was okay as long as only white people were getting it primarily, it was okay. But when a program, when something is perceived as white folk getting the benefit, it's okay. That's the reason why they didn't like the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare. They specifically called it Obamacare because they wanted to communicate the idea that, see, you got a lot of undeserving black people going to get it, even though the truth of the matter is more white people benefit from all these programs than black folks do. But if they can convince you that this is going to help black people, people don't want it. People will actually vote against things that will help them because they think that black people are getting something they don't deserve. And then finally, we want to deal with the so-called social conservatives, the religious conservatives, who insist that this is about moral values. This is about Roe v. Wade. This is about prayer in school. This is about these other values. Again, some people might legitimately believe that. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. There's a problem with the origin story of this. You see, after Roe v. Wade, a lot of these Southern Baptists and other folks who now claim that this is why they got involved in politics, that's false. That's false. That is not what happened. That is not what happened. Now, Catholic Rights and Life Committee was there at the beginning, but the Southern Baptists, no, they weren't there. They weren't there. You know what? But when the IRS under the Carter administration started going after these so-called Christian schools who had tax support, who were tax exempt, but they were engaging in discrimination. And so we're going to take your status. That's when they ran to the moral majority, and that's when they endorsed Ronald Reagan, but see, they've lied about that. Now, again, there are people who may legitimately believe some of these things, but what we have to understand is there is an unholy alliance between the well-meaning but badly informed, and those who know the truth, but they are cynical. So they will put out the people who really are well-meaning, and they put them out front because they genuinely believe what they're saying. And so they're effective while they sit in the room and they laugh at us, and they're making a fool out of everybody. You know, and that's the Republican Party. That's the modern Republican Party. Now, and this has been an enormously effective strategy. Between 1968 and 2008, the Republicans controlled the White House in 28 out of those 40 years. Okay, and by 1994, they were able to take over both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years, and they were also able to take over a lot of state legislatures, and they controlled 30 of the nation's governorships. And it did not happen one time, but and because of that, they were able to remake the federal judiciary. You know, as presidents have the ability to make appointments to the Supreme Court, and so this strategy has been an enormously effective approach to the GOP. You know, but it gives them plausible deniability. So it's not about race, it's about this, it's about that. It's about plausible deniability from the charge of being racist. And in fact, they'll turn it around on you. Say, well, no, we're not racist, you are. You're racist for bringing it up. So we started to kind of look at the long term of this. You know, we see a pattern, obviously. There's a pattern there's a pattern of reform, reversal, rinse and repeat. Reform, reversal, rinse, and repeat. In other words, every period of black progress, or sometimes just the perception of black progress, is followed by a predictable white backlash. So every period of black progress is followed by a predictable white backlash. Frederick Douglass, said it best, I think. He says, power never concedes anything without demand. It never has, and it never will. And that was a very true statement. Power never concedes anything without demand. But we also need to add something else to that idea. It's not just that power never concedes anything without demand. It's also true that those who have been forced to concede power or to cede power always try to take it back. They always try to take it back. And sometimes in taking it back, they don't always use the same methods as they used before. And in fact, sometimes if you do it in a way that's a little more subtle, people may not even recognize that their rights have been stolen in the first place. And so this is something that we think we have to get our minds around, because sometimes we act like, well, why are we still fighting the same battle? We thought this issue was solved. Why are we still dealing with the same thing that our parents' generation was dealing with? Because power doesn't concede anything. People are just not in the habit of giving up power. That's not how stuff works. And what we also need to understand, this is not something that is unique to black people, to white people in the United States. This is just how power works. This is just how power works. I'm gonna use England as an example, because that's where our so-called forebears came from. There was they signed King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215. He gave up some of his power to the nobles. Now, he didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. Literally, he had a rebellion on his hands. So they kind of forced him to sign this treaty. And they also had the sharpshooters hide in the bushes in case he reneged. So he signed it under duress. Okay. Now he had every intention of going back on what he said. Okay, but he died the following year, so he wasn't able to do that. However, subsequent English kings eventually got to the point where we ignored the Magna Carta. We do what we want. Eventually, that things came to a head, and they had a civil war. And make a long story short, the king lost. And when he lost, he really lost. They beheaded him. And then there was a period after that, Oliver Cromwell tried to come up with this benevolent republic, and that lasted for a little while, and he died without a succession plan. And so after the chaos, because people have a hard time imagining how the world could be different, they restored the monarchy. They brought the king back. After that, same thing happened in France after their revolution. All these great things happened. They killed the king. They killed the queen. They had a revolution. Then got out of hand. And then Napoleon takes over. And runs roughshod. Make a long story short, Napoleon is defeated finally. The other governments in Europe who are determined to make sure that it doesn't happen again, they restored the French monarchy. And so if you had lived through all of that, you would kind of wonder, so what was all this for? So this is not a problem that's unique to black people. So we gotta get used to this. We gotta get used to this idea that whenever you make progress, expect the backlash, because it's coming. Don't get comfortable. Don't rest in our laurels. Don't matter if you vote or not. Because while you sleeping, they working. However, despite all of this, our God is still the Lord of history. Our God is still the Lord of history. In the book of Daniel, chapter 2, I'm going to read out a New International Version. It says, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him." And he goes on and on and on. About this. Men think they have power. Men conspire, and the nations came together and conspire, and God laughs. God laughs. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was powerful. He was powerful, and he built the statue of gold, and he expected everybody to bow down to the statue. But you have three people who you've put over your affairs. They're not paying any attention to you. So they bring them in. Bring them in. Now, I've heard about you, what you guys have done. Now, if you bow down, it's okay. I'll forgive you. He says we don't have to defend ourselves with you in this manner. You know what? The God we serve is able to rescue us from this burning furnace. But even if he does not, we will not bow down to your gods. And he's so angry. He throws them in there. Let's light it hot. We're going to make it hotter. Didn't happen. Now the soldiers who threw them in there died. They were all right. He said, Nebuchadnezzar said, no God can save like that. Pilate said, don't you know I have the power over you? I can set you free. You don't have any power over me. The only power you have is what you've been received from above. Men think that they have power, but God has power. God is the one that's still on the throne. God is the one who allows some nations to rise, some nations to fall. And Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so the same God who was the Lord of history in the Old Testament is the same God who is the Lord of history now. And so the interesting thing about this is that you hear a whole lot of talk these days about so-called Christian nationalism. This idea that America was founded on these Christian principles, that it treats America like it's a reincarnation of Israel, that its people were founded on these principles of God, but somehow we moved away from that, and so we need to restore that in order to be right with God. And there are a couple of problems with this. Number one is bad history, number one, because we talk about reasons why that's not true, but it's also bad theology. Because see, when Peter is talking about you are a holy priesthood, a royal nation, a people belonging to God, he's talking about the church. You see, God used Israel for a time, but it was designed to redeem the world. It was not their physical nation that he's creating a new nation. So God doesn't need America for that purpose. He's already accomplished what he wants through Jesus Christ. So it's just not just bad history, it's bad theology. And it's also foolish because, it shows a lack of understanding of who America actually is. See, America acts like it's Israel. But America has more in common with Egypt. America acts like, it's one nation under God, but its spirit is more like the Roman Empire that thought it was God. See, when the white folks got mad at Jeremiah Wright, and he says, "God damn America for thinking it is God." And they were all upset about this, and how could Obama sit in this man's church for so long? But see, black people hear those kind of things all the time. And where did he lie? Where did he lie? America thinks it is God. And the same God that took down the Egyptian empire, the same God that took down the Babylonian empire, the same God that took down the Medo-Persian empire, the same God who took down Alexander the Great's kingdom, who took down the Roman Empire, who took down the British Empire. America better be on guard. If America does not repent, God is still God. God is still God. And he's going to deal with this country. And so, America just better get it right. And so we need to think about what kind of people we need to be. Because and while it's important for us to be citizens of this country and do what we can to help people and to push rights forward, and the most political thing that the church can do is to be the church. It's to actually be a place that preaches the gospel and feeds the hungry and takes up the cause to do justice. It's a false choice whether or not we're going to do, whether or not we're going to preach personal salvation or preach justice. The church is supposed to do both. And when the church is the church, that's the most political thing the church must do, because it's recognizing that its citizenship is in heaven. And it's not on earth. And so let me stop before a sermon begins.
We have been helped. We have been blessed, and we are grateful again to Dr. Samuels for a wonderful presentation. We're grateful for your presence. If there are those of you who are viewing who would like the information that Dr. Samuels has distributed to us here, you can reach us here at the church. Give us your email address, and we will be more than happy to forward that to you. May we stand together, please? Repeat after me, please. The Lord bless you.
Lord bless you.
The Lord keep you.
Lord keep you.
The Lord make his face shine upon you
Lord make his face shine upon
and give you peace. Amen. Have a good night.